Welcome. Today we are going to jump into the most tragic shark attack stories ever. From a Florida coastline, where a high school field trip ended with a classmate pulled from the surf, to a diver's fatal encounter with an oceanic white-tip. It was March 3rd, 2018, several miles off the KwaZulu-Natal coast of South Africa. The water looked calm from a distance, but the deep channel beneath carried a steady pull that seasoned ocean swimmers recognized as both useful and dangerous. Tarek Milner, 36, had traveled from Colorado to train for an international ultra-distance ocean swim event. Colleagues said he preferred solo endurance training because it gave him a sense of control that structured pool work never did. His motivation for the trip was straightforward: test himself in long, uninterrupted open water that behaved nothing like inland lakes. He aimed to complete a full 8-mile ocean training segment, something he believed would give him an edge in competition. Tarek studied tide charts, checked wind patterns, and verified current strength with his support kayaker, a local guide named Bryn Halland. He wanted to hold a steady pace for the first hour and use the deep water section to measure his fatigue curve. His decisions were understandable for someone with endurance experience, but he underestimated how quickly predators could move through the channels beyond the nets. Bryn later said that this particular training zone was not commonly used by swimmers due to deep pelagic traffic, something Tarek dismissed as manageable. The horizon dissolved into a pale smear of light as swells rose and fell, creating rolling walls that blocked visibility every few seconds. Shortfin mako sharks patrol offshore channels at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour, with streamlined bodies and long snouts built for rapid acceleration. They strike by targeting movement at the surface, often mistaking swimmers for injured fish. Their jaws can exert several hundred pounds of force, with teeth designed to shear rather than crush. In low visibility conditions, reflective wetsuit panels or flutter kicks can be misinterpreted as prey movement. Dive boat at the harbor mentioned spotting a fast-moving shark earlier that morning. The warning never reached Bryn or Tarek. Unaware of the danger, Tarek tightened the straps on his goggles and said he would stay visible next to the kayak. He believed his bright swim cap, paced breathing, and predictable strokes reduced the risk. Bryn watched him stretch, noting the small but persistent chop forming on the water. They paddled out past the last buoy line. Tarek entered the water smoothly and began his stroke rhythm, keeping within 15 feet of the kayak. The visibility under the surface was limited, with particles suspended in the water creating shifting shadows. About 20 minutes in, Bryn heard a faint scattering noise on his left, a sound baitfish make when something large moves beneath them. He called to Tarek to pause, but the swimmer kept his rhythm, focused on reaching the 1-mile marker on his GPS tracker. First indication of the strike came from the water itself. Bryn saw a sudden plume erupt around Tarek, vertical burst of foam and red mixing at the surface. The impact lifted the swimmer partially out of the water, his body arching as if slammed from below by a force no human could resist. The sound was not a splash, but a hard, blunt concussion. The mako hit him from the right side, tearing deeply into his torso. Due to its speed, the shark's momentum carried it several feet past Tarek. Before it twisted sharply and re-engaged, Bryn saw the tail flick in a tight arc, sending vibrations across the surface. Tarek's arm lifted reflexively, but the movement was uncoordinated, likely more a reaction to force than an intentional motion. The shark clamped again onto his midsection, jerking him downward in a short, violent drag. Witnesses on a returning fishing charter, still over 200 yards away, reported seeing a brief movement beneath the surface, and a body pulled below for a moment before resurfacing limp. The mako released him after the second bite, typical behavior when the initial hit determines the prey is not a fish target. Bryn paddled hard into the blood-mixed water. Tarek floated on his back, his wetsuit torn open from ribcage to hip. The injuries were catastrophic, with deep shearing lacerations exposing bone and soft tissue, and the blood loss was immediate and heavy. Bryn pulled him alongside the kayak, looping an arm under his shoulders in an attempt to stabilize him. The swimmer made no sound, no voluntary movement. A third disturbance appeared under the surface, a dark streak that passed within feet of Bryn's kayak. He froze, gripping the edge of the boat to keep balance as the water pulsed below. The shark did not strike again, but its presence made movement toward shore, slow and cautious. Bryn began towing Tarek, kicking and paddling with uneven bursts, eyes scanning the swells for more shadows. The tow back to the responding vessel took roughly 7 minutes, a pace Bryn later described as the fastest he could manage without capsizing. It took nearly 10 minutes to reach the first responding rescue boat, which had been radioed by the fishing charter. By then, Tarek showed no sign of respiration. Medics pulled him aboard and began basic assessment. The extent of the trauma made the conclusion immediate. Force and depth of the initial strike had destroyed vital organs and vessels, killing him. Officials later examined Tarek's gear and the wound patterns, concluding that the Mako had been a large adult, likely drawn into the channel by increased bait fish activity. The Coastal Authority released a brief report, issuing a general advisory to open water users not to train beyond protective zones during periods of high pelagic movement. Bryn was left deeply shaken, both physically and mentally, after the attack. In the days following, he underwent evaluation by local authorities and trauma counselors. He took a year-long leave from guiding and competitive support duties.
It was the 12th of June 2015, and the shoreline along Gulf Shores, Alabama, was holding the kind of late afternoon heat that pulls people out toward the surf rather than away from it. The beach was full of people fishing that day. They stood in the shallow water, reeled in small fish, and talked quietly. Everything felt calm and easy. Because it was so peaceful, nobody expected what happened next. When something goes wrong in a place that quiet, it happens so fast you can barely believe it. Brent Vance was 41. He had a steady job back home that kept him on a regular weekday schedule, and shoreline fishing was the thing he saved his weekends for. People who knew him described someone proud of his skill on the water, not loud about it, but quietly competitive. He used heavier tackle than most of the guys around him, and he liked landing fish other people couldn't. His friends said he was the kind of fisherman who would stand in one spot for hours if it meant winning a fight with whatever was on the other end of his line. Late in the afternoon, Brent hooked something big. Whatever it was started thrashing hard out past the break, and from the way the rod was bending, it was clear this was not an average catch. His friends nearby saw the same thing. They could see turbulence farther out water moving in a way that didn't match the chop around it. More than one of them told him to cut the line. He didn't. To keep tension on the line, he stepped from 3 feet of water into a deeper 5 to 6 foot section near the Gulf Shores drop-off. A few steps there can put you off the shelf and unable to brace against a strong pull. The hooked fish kept bleeding as it fought, leaving a visible trail in the water, the kind that carries. A tiger shark moving along that drop-off would not have needed any introduction to that scene. A wounded, thrashing fish bleeding in warm coastal water is one of the clearest signals in the ocean. Tiger sharks are opportunistic by nature, and that part of the Gulf is a known corridor for them during the summer months. According to friends watching from the beach, the shark came in from deeper water and took the hooked fish in a single hard pull. The rod jerked forward so violently that Brent was pulled off balance immediately. He didn't let go. I fish, but I'm not as good as him. Still, I know how it feels when a big fish pulls on the line. To be honest, I think I would have held on too. That is the scariest part of the story for me. The shifting sand under his feet was already working against him, and the deeper water meant he had nothing solid to plant against. As the line stayed live and the shark stayed on the fish remains, Brent was pulled farther out. Witnesses said his hands and forearms got caught up in the struggle line, rod, and movement, all happening at once in shallow surf that was no longer shallow for him. Heavy tackle is built to handle force, not to release it gracefully. When the pull is bigger than the angler is what gives way. He let go of the rod eventually, but by then he was already off the shelf and in trouble. The shark, the fish, and the bleeding water were all in the same close space he was trying to back out of. Contact with him came in the middle of that turbulence. His friends described the surface going chaotic, then watched him go under. He did not come back up. The whole thing, from the first hard pull to the moment they lost sight of him, played out faster than any of them could react from the beach. A friend pulled the now slack line back in from the beach a short time later. That line is part of what investigators worked from, along with phone video from another person on shore that caught the rod bending hard toward deeper water in the last seconds before it disappeared under the surface. None of the footage showed a clean shot of the shark itself, but the sequence was consistent with everything the friends described. Recovery crews searched the immediate area along the drop-off and located him later that evening in deeper water, well past the point where he had originally been standing. The official findings confirmed Brent's death as a fatal shark-related incident, with the primary cause listed as catastrophic injury and drowning in deeper water after losing footing during the line struggle. No beach closures were issued afterward. The findings were filed, and the stretch of shoreline stayed open the next morning. A small advisory was posted about handling hooked fish during active feeding conditions, but most beachgoers passed it without reading. How many of those beach advisories have you walked past without reading? Be honest. It was the 14th of February 2017, and the Zambezi was running high from weeks of heavy rain. The gorge below the falls was swollen with fast brown water, way above where it normally sits during the dry season. An informal local guide operation, completely separate from the established tourism companies near the falls and carrying no license, insurance, or safety certification, offered guided swims in a seasonal gorge pool several kilometers downstream from the main tourism zone, formed by a submerged rock lip that separates the pool from the main river channel. During low water months, the barrier sits well above the current and the pool is basically cut off from the river, which is what makes it a tourist attraction in the first place. Guides routinely told visitors that crocodiles were present elsewhere along the river system, but considered the pool isolated during normal water levels. During high water, though, the barrier gets partially submerged. The company had a posted policy to suspend operations when levels exceeded a certain gauge reading, but investigators later found guides had continued operating under discretionary assessments despite elevated readings for several days before the incident. Jolien van den Berge, 26, was a Belgian backpacker 4 months into a 6-month trip through East and Southern Africa. She'd booked the swim through her hostel, and from the photos on the brochure, it looked incredible. It was supposed to be the most adventurous thing on her whole itinerary. The guide led a group of 8 tourists to the pool edge. The water was higher and faster than normal. 18 inches sounds insignificant until you realize that was enough to connect the pool to crocodile habitat upstream. I keep coming back to that number because that was the margin the operator decided was still safe enough to send people in. Nile crocodiles are among Africa's most dangerous predators. During the rainy season, rising water allows crocodiles to move through areas inaccessible during drier months, effectively invisible in fast, turbid water. Jolien entered the pool with 2 other tourists. The guide positioned himself at the rock lip monitoring flow. About 10 minutes in, Jolien moved toward the lip for a photo at the edge, and the current was way stronger than she expected. Investigators believe a crocodile had moved through the overflow zone from the main channel into the pool area, something impossible at normal water levels. In the turbid water, the animal was undetectable. The attack came without warning. Jolien was pulled from her position at the rock lip. Other tourists in the pool saw a brief violent disturbance before she disappeared over the lip into the main channel. The guide cleared the remaining tourists immediately. A search over the following 2 days recovered Jolien's remains downstream. Injuries were consistent with crocodile predation and post-mortem river scavenging. The investigation found the company had been operating above its posted safety threshold. The company ceased operations. Zambian authorities issued new regulations requiring river-level verification at gorge swimming sites. No footage exists from the pool. No GoPro, no phone video, nothing. Just witness accounts and a gauge reading that said don't operate and a company that sent tourists in anyway. Sometimes the absence of footage is worse because your brain fills in whatever it wants, and mine won't stop. It was September 18th, 2013, and the Florida coastline carried the specific weight of late summer on the Gulf, the kind of heat that hasn't fully released its grip, where the air still holds humidity from months of afternoon storms, and the water temperature remains elevated from a season of uninterrupted sun. The sky was clear and bright, the kind of day that reads as safe without asking to be examined. Jason Sloan was 17 years old, athletic, involved in soccer at his school, and holding a part-time job at a local sporting goods store. He had come to a stretch of Florida coastline that morning as part of a marine science field trip organized by his school, a program that brought students to a small coastal education facility near the beach for the day. By early afternoon, the morning's scheduled programming had wrapped up. Students had been released for unstructured time before the buses returned, and the beach was accessible. Warning signs were posted along the access points. They referenced seasonal shark activity and advised visitors to remain in the shallow surf. Recent rainfall had reduced visibility near the shoreline runoff, carrying sediment into the coastal shallows in the way that follows heavy precipitation along this stretch of the Gulf Coast. Staff at the facility had noted that morning that schools of baitfish had been moving through the area. If those three conditions are present simultaneously, reduced visibility, active baitfish, and posted shark advisories entering the water should not be the decision you make. Each of those factors on its own warrants caution. Together, they describe exactly the kind of environment the warning signs were designed to address. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm standing at a distance pointing at a checklist, but I keep thinking about those signs at the access points. And I keep thinking about how many people walked past them that morning, and how the signs said exactly what was about to happen in plain language before it happened. A loose game of catch started near the water's edge during the break. A throw went long and landed beyond the sandbar, running parallel to shore the submerged ridge, shallow enough to wade across, that separated the surf zone from deeper water on its offshore side. Jason went in after it. The sandbar made the approach deceptively simple. A person can wade across it in shin-deep water, reach the other side, and find themselves standing in chest-deep water 30 to 40 yards from shore without any single step feeling like a threshold was crossed. That's the detail that stays with me about this. There was no moment where he would have stopped and thought, but it just happened gradually, the way so many fatal decisions do. One ordinary step after another until the ordinary steps run out. Jason crossed it. Bull sharks are the species most consistently implicated in shallow nearshore attacks along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the United States. They are built for inshore environments physiologically capable of tolerating fresh water, which means they move into estuaries, tidal systems, and the murky water behind sandbars with regularity. They are pursuit predators that navigate through turbidity using their lateral line, a pressure detection system that does not require visual clarity and operate with high effectiveness in exactly the conditions Jason was standing in. The attack involved multiple bites. The first contact was to the thigh, a bite that severed the femoral artery, the major blood vessel running through the upper leg that, once breached at this scale, produces blood loss at a rate that even an immediate response cannot reliably contain. The subsequent bites compounded the structural damage before Jason could be reached. Lifeguards entered the water immediately. Teachers cleared students back from the shoreline. I think about those teachers a lot. They were there for a school trip. They were responsible for these kids. And in the span of an afternoon break, they went from supervising free time on a beach to watching something that no teacher should ever have to witness. First aid was applied on the beach, and transport to a medical facility was rapid. The femoral injury was not survivable within the time available. Jason Sloan died shortly after reaching the hospital.
Was June 4th, 2016, along a fog-heavy stretch of the northern California coast. Break was quiet, the water flattened by morning tide, and the visibility poor enough that even nearby figures were reduced to silhouettes. Arvik Sloan, 29, had driven up from Petaluma before dawn to surf, a habit he kept even on days when conditions were marginal. He worked as a cabinetry finisher for a small custom shop and was known for taking solitary morning sessions before his shifts. To him, fog meant fewer people and cleaner shoulders. His choices were predictable for someone experienced, but inclined to treat warning signs as inconveniences rather than risks. Arvik's reputation among local surfers was that of a quiet regular who didn't exaggerate his skills, but also didn't back down from difficult water. He kept his gear in meticulous shape, waxed his board evenly, checked his leash every time, and kept a mental log of currents. That morning, he intended to test a new wetsuit and get a few long rides on the outer other left shoulder, likely before the wind picked up. Before paddling out, Arvik walked past a sign noting recent shark activity. Two surfers exiting the water mentioned that the visibility had dropped in the last half hour. Arvik brushed off the warnings, saying he would stay farther outside the main cluster to avoid accidentally drifting into someone. He did not consider that going farther out in fog placed him in deeper, seal-dense hunting lanes, conditions that increase ambush probability. Once Arvik paddled past the inner break, the fog thickened enough that he lost sight of the beach. He paused to listen, hearing faint barks of harbor seals somewhere to his South Seals haul out on near-shore rocks in that region, and fog often pushes them into the water earlier than usual. He considered shifting back toward the group, but decided he had already committed to the outer shoulder. Great white sharks frequent Northern California for one reason: seals. Adults can reach over 15 feet and more than 2,000 pounds, with a bite force capable of crushing bone in a single strike. They hunt by ambush, rising from below in low visibility conditions to target silhouettes at the surface. Morning fog, in particular, is cited in multiple incident reports as a contributing factor in mistaken identity strikes. A nearby surfer later reported hearing a single sharp splash out of rhythm with the waves. The water around Arvik churned, followed by a deep, percussive thud, heavy enough that the witness felt it through his board. The shark hit from directly below, lifting Arvik slightly before the force dragged him down. The strike tore into his torso, teeth creating a wide arc of tissue damage, later determined to be consistent with a large adult white. The bite width, aligned with a shark, estimated between 14 and 16 feet, typical for the region's seasonal aggregations. Arvik's board shot upward as the leash snapped under tension. The shark released him briefly, a common behavior when a shark registers an object as non-prey after the initial strike. Witnesses saw his body rise just under the surface, limp, before the shark surged again from the side. The second bite clamped onto his hip and lower back. Two surfers paddled hard toward him, shouting for others to call for help. The visibility forced them to follow the red spreading trail rather than his form. One caught a glimpse of the shark's tail fin, cutting a line beneath the surface before disappearing into the murk. The water around Arvik rolled in small, irregular pulses, the last sign of movement before everything went still. When the first rescuer reached him, Arvik was floating face down, his wetsuit torn open across the chest and side. The wounds were catastrophic, with exposed bone and heavy arterial bleeding clouding the water. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but their assessment was immediate. The trauma had destroyed major vessels and compromised vital organs. They stated that the strike was likely unsurvivable from the moment of impact. The beach was closed for 24 hours, though no additional shark activity was observed. Wildlife officials inspected Arvik's board and the wounds, concluding that the attacker was likely a large adult great white feeding in shallow channels influenced by fog and seal movement. This matched ongoing seasonal tracking data for the area. Arvik's family kept details private, issuing only a short statement requesting privacy. Local surfers left flowers near the trailhead, noting that the conditions had given every warning possible.
It was the 10th of April, 2016, and the water off Bimini was doing what it always does this time of year, sitting bright, clear, and almost too calm to take seriously. From the deck of a small tour boat, the surface looked like glass. You could see straight down into shifting blue, the kind of clarity that makes people forget how deep open water really is. The weather was warm, the wind was light, and the conditions were exactly what a shark-feeding excursion would advertise. Postcard conditions. That detail matters because nothing about the setting that afternoon felt like a warning. It felt like the start of a vacation memory. Bimini sits just off the Florida coast and has built a small industry around getting tourists close to bull sharks. The pitch is simple: a boat, a guide, bait in the water, and a controlled experience with animals most people only ever see on a screen. It feels managed. It feels safe. The boats are small, the crew handles the bait, and you stay on board. That sense of structure is what people are paying for. Whether it actually protects them is a different question, one that doesn't get asked until something goes wrong. Holly Beck was 26. She worked in a customer-facing role back home and used vacations to do the kinds of things that filmed well. People who knew her described someone outgoing, drawn to experiences with a story behind them, and comfortable in front of a camera. She was not careless. She had grown up filming everything, and the closer she could get, the better the footage. Friends said she had been excited about this trip for months, especially the shark excursion, talking about it often before the trip. That instinct is what put her at the railing that afternoon. The crew dropped bait into the water shortly after the boat anchored. Within minutes, bull sharks started moving in. Witnesses said there were several, circling tight to the boat, breaking the surface in fast passes near the bait. Passengers leaned in along the railings to film. That part is normal on these trips. The boat is the safe zone. The water beside it isn't. Holly worked her way to the edge with her phone out. She wasn't the only one filming, but she was leaning the farthest. Other passengers confirmed she was extending her arm well past the rail to get a cleaner angle into the bait zone. Then the boat shifted. I have seen people act like that before. When you take a video, you only look at the screen. You forget about the railing, the water, how far down it is. You lose track of everything else. It wasn't dramatic, just the kind of small movement a boat makes when people shift or water rolls under it. But she was already past her center of gravity. Witnesses said she went over the rail in one motion, phone first, body following. She landed directly in the active bait zone alongside the boat. No slow slide, no chance to grab the rail. From above, it looked like she tipped out of frame. A bull shark already feeding less than 10 feet away redirected almost immediately toward the splash. That isn't unusual. It's exactly what bull sharks do when sudden movement enters a feeding area. Initial contact came at close range. The bite appeared singular but severe, striking her upper body and arm and forcing her under in one motion rather than a prolonged attack. The water around her churned and darkened fast. The water around the bait zone became chaotic enough that witnesses struggled to tell where Holly was in the turbulence. Passengers shouted from above, and crew moved immediately along the side of the boat, trying to reach her as quickly as possible. There were brief glimpses of movement near the surface, but no clear repeated attack pattern, just confusion, splashing, and loss of visual contact. Then the surface closed over with turbulence, and for several seconds nobody could see her. The deck went from phones raised to people frozen in place. The crew managed to pull her back onto the boat. By that point, the injuries were too severe to manage with anything on board. She did not survive the trip back to shore. The boat radioed in, but the realistic window for intervention had already closed. Multiple passengers had been filming when she went over. That footage became the core of the investigation. It captured the lean, the shift, the fall, the initial contact, and the response. Investigators didn't have to guess, it was recorded from multiple angles. Authorities questioned operators about positioning, railing height, and proximity to feeding zones. Findings cited the bait operation, the close circling of sharks, and Holly's position over the rail as central factors. No charges were filed. Excursions continued, with stricter positioning rules added afterward. If I were on that boat, phone out, sharks below me, I'd like to think I'd stay back. But I've seen my own footage. I'm leaning further than I remember. I'm not sure I'm any different. It was the 22nd of July 2018, and the summer water off the Yucatan coast was warm and clear. The seasonal bull shark aggregation along the Riviera Maya was in full swing, and there were a bunch of dive operators running these cage-free shark encounters where you basically dive without any barrier among sharks that have been lured in with frozen bait. The operator the Falks booked through was not registered with local dive authorities and had been running cage-free feeds without required permits, picking up clients through hostile referrals and word of mouth. Colton Falk, 42, was a fire station captain from Chattanooga, Tennessee, with over 100 log dives. His wife, Deanne, 40, had around 40. They were celebrating their 15th anniversary, and the shark dive was Colton's pick. He'd been researching cage-free shark operations for months, and this trip was finally his chance to actually do it. The operator's method was pretty standard for that area. Frozen bait blocks on the sandy bottom, divers positioned low near the bottom, roughly 20 to 25 feet away, 2 dive masters between the sharks and the clients. The morning conditions were good. Visibility roughly 50 feet. The group included the Falks and 4 other clients. At least 6 or 7 bull sharks were present when the group descended. Bull sharks are considered one of the shark species most frequently associated with serious attacks in shallow coastal water. They're territorial feeders that get really competitive around food. And when you've got multiple bulls converging on one bait source, the behavior can escalate fast. The frozen bait, which is supposed to break down slowly, fell apart way faster than expected in the warm water and released this concentrated scent plume all at once. The shark's behavior changed almost immediately, Passes got tighter and faster. One shark struck the remains of the bait block, and the impact scattered fragments toward the dive line. Multiple sharks followed the fragments toward the divers. Colton, kneeling at the end of the line nearest the scattered bait, was struck by a large bull shark making a competitive pass. The bite hit his right arm and shoulder. Witnesses believed a second shark may have made contact during the feeding surge. Deanne and the other divers were ushered to the surface by the dive masters. Colton was pulled upward but had sustained massive injuries. They got him onto the boat, and the crew tried everything they could, but the combined bite injuries had caused catastrophic blood loss. He lost consciousness on the boat and was pronounced dead at the dock after emergency crews couldn't revive him. Deanne was physically uninjured. Colton picked this dive for his anniversary. 15 years of marriage, and he chose to spend the celebration kneeling on sand 20 feet from bull sharks with nothing between them except 2 dive masters and a block of frozen fish. I'm not saying he was reckless because he trusted the operator and the operator said it was safe, but the bait didn't cooperate, and once that scent hit the water, the whole system fell apart in about 30 seconds. The operator suspended shark feed dives after the investigation. Several operators along the coast temporarily suspended similar dives while authorities reviewed bait handling procedures. It was May 12, 2021, and the Red Sea off the Egyptian coast sat under the kind of spring sun that arrives before the summer heat makes the region genuinely brutal, warm, and direct, the surface reflecting it in flattened points of white. Below the surface, visibility in the offshore reef systems was exceptional, the kind of clarity that draws divers from across the world. Above it, a moderate swell had been building through the afternoon, roughening the surface in a way that made maintaining visual contact between a dive vessel and its divers considerably more difficult than the morning conditions had suggested it would be. Conrad Pike was 44 years old, a petroleum engineer from Scotland who had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating dives across multiple regions. The kind of diver who had moved well past the entry-level phase into territory where the activity felt less like a practiced skill and more like an established fact about who he was. He had joined a week-long expedition run by a small private liveaboard operation, a single vessel, limited guests, launching from a minor coastal harbor to access offshore reef sites that required a full day of travel to reach the kind of remote, independently operated trip that experienced divers seek out specifically for what it offers beyond commercial reef tourism. The afternoon dive had been a drift dive along an offshore reef wall. Strong subsurface currents had progressively separated the group during the descent, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the way that drift dives work, each diver managing their own buoyancy and trajectory, distances widening, without any single visible moment marking the chain. By the time the group began ascending, Conrad was farther from the others than buddy protocol should have permitted. He surfaced in isolation, the vessel at significant distance, and the building's swell and chop made him difficult to locate from the deck. Conrad deployed his surface marker buoy immediately. Under normal conditions, the brightly colored inflatable would have been visible to the boat crew within minutes, but the swell running that afternoon, the troughs between wave faces, the chop collapsing sightlines kept pulling the marker below the crew's visible horizon from that distance. He had a whistle. The wind and wave noise absorbed it. He drifted, and the current carried him further from the dive site while the boat worked to locate his position. More than an hour passed at the surface. He had done the right things. The conditions had neutralized them. I have to stop there for a second because this is the case that genuinely bothers me the most. Conrad didn't ignore a warning. He didn't cross a barrier or dismiss an advisory. He surfaced, deployed his marker, used his whistle, and waited. He did exactly what the training says to do, and the ocean just didn't cooperate. There's a particular cruelty in that I don't think I'll ever fully make peace with. An extended, isolated surface wait in open water in this stretch of the Red Sea is not a neutral situation. An experienced diver knows this. Knowing it and being able to do anything additional about it with your equipment already deployed and a boat searching are not always the same thing, but the time accumulating at the surface was doing something regardless. Oceanic white-tip sharks are one of the genuinely dangerous species in open ocean environments, not because of aggression in the conventional sense, but because of persistence. They are pelagic animals, built for the deep, open water column far from coastlines and reef systems. Typically between 6 and 10 feet in length and weighing between 200 and 370 pounds, they are recognized by their broadly rounded, white-tipped pectoral fins held characteristically outstretched. The first shark appeared approximately 70 minutes after Conrad surfaced. A second followed not long after. Initial passes were wide, broad arcs. At the outer edge of clear visibility, pectoral fins extended, unhurried. As time in the water extended and the boat remained out of reach, the passes shortened. The second animal was making tighter circles than the first. The vessel was still searching. The distance between where Conrad was and where the crew was looking had continued to grow. By the time the liveaboard crew located his position and maneuvered to reach him, the attack had already occurred. Conrad Pike died from his injuries. He was 44 years old, with nearly 2 decades of diving experience behind him.
It was May 18th, 2015, off the coast of Western Australia, where the swells rolled in long, even lines beneath a gray morning sky. The sea felt strangely quiet, despite the rhythmic movement, the kind of subdued surface that hid far more activity beneath than above. The kayaker, Soren Browning, 34, had come from Minnesota after saving for years to complete a self-planned marine wildlife film project. He worked as a freelance videographer, known for steady, methodical work rather than artistic flair. For this trip in Australia, he wanted to capture high-resolution footage of dolphin behavior in open water for a conservation group that had commissioned a short educational reel. Soren believed that staying near the surface, remaining predictable, and keeping distance from active feeding zones reduced danger to near zero. His choice to follow a pod of dolphins offshore made sense for his project, but he underestimated how rapidly feeding conditions could change and the presence of larger predators lurking below. Bronze whalers can exceed 10 feet in length and often patrol coastal regions where baitfish gather, using bursts of acceleration to investigate disturbances. Dusky sharks, larger and heavier, sometimes reaching 12 feet, tend to move selectively around active feeding zones, attacking silhouettes at the surface when prey activity triggers an opportunistic response. Both species rely on movement cues and can be drawn in by dense bait balls, especially when dolphins drive fish upward. Both species are generally cautious around human-sized objects, but may investigate violently if surface commotion mimics prey behavior. Soren's hydrophone had picked up rapid clicking patterns from dolphins the previous day, a sign they were hunting intensively. He continued toward them, believing that maintaining a distance of 30 to 40 yards would keep him clear of danger. He filmed steadily, his kayak drifting with the swell. About 40 minutes in, the dolphins changed direction abruptly, their movements becoming sharper as they circled a patch of rippling water ahead. Small fish began leaping at the surface. Soren kept his position, aiming his camera at the disturbance. What he did not see was the bait ball forming beneath him, a dense sphere of fish driven upward. His kayak drifted directly over it in under a minute. The first impact sounded like a muffled crack against the hull, jolting the kayak sideways. Soren braced instinctively, but a second ram from below tilted the craft sharply. Witnesses on a charter boat roughly 300 yards away saw the kayak pitch upward at a steep angle before rolling completely. Bronze whaler's strike flipped him cleanly, sending him into the water with his legs splaying outward as he surfaced. The initial strike likely served as a non-predatory investigative bump rather than a feeding attempt. He gasped once, sharp intake caught on his GoPro audio, followed by the heavy slap of his displaced kayak hitting the water beside him. The whaler circled beneath, but it did not attack. The turbulence of the baitfish kept it moving erratically. Soren struggled to right the kayak, grabbing its edge, his movements fast and uneven, exactly the type of surface disturbance that attracts attention during feeding activity. From the charter boat, 2 passengers saw a long, dark shape pass beneath him in a smooth arc. The dusky shark approached from deeper water, drawn by the thrashing and the bait ball dispersing from the earlier collision. It surfaced in a swift vertical angle, striking Soren from behind just as he attempted to climb onto his overturned kayak. The bite locked onto his right thigh and hip, pulling him sideways and down. The shark shook once, an efficient, controlled motion. Before releasing and circling again, Soren's leg showed massive tearing. The injuries were consistent with a single large shark bite, rather than repeated predatory feeding, which usually involves repeated head shakes. He tried to push himself upward, one arm gripping the kayak, but his movements weakened rapidly. The Dusky made a second pass, this time seizing him around the lower back. The motion motion dragged him below the surface again for several seconds. When he resurfaced, his torso twisted unnaturally, and his arms slipped from the kayak's edge. The shark did not return for a third strike. The bronze whaler made a brief investigative sweep, bumping his body from beneath, but did not engage further. Soren drifted half-submerged, unresponsive, his life vest keeping him partially afloat, despite extensive trauma. The charter boat crew radioed for emergency services while maneuvering closer, but the distance and cautious approach required in the presence of sharks slowed them. By the time they reached him, Soren showed no respirations or voluntary movement. They pulled him aboard with a gaff hook secured through his vest to avoid placing hands in the water. Medics confirmed that the injuries included massive soft tissue trauma and severed major vessels, unsurvivable in minutes without immediate surgical intervention. Marine authorities later reviewed footage and the witness accounts, concluding that the baitball formation directly beneath the kayak triggered both shark approaches. The initial impact from the bronze whaler created enough chaos to draw the Dusky into the zone. Soren's equipment was recovered and returned to his family. His project files were mostly intact. A brief notice circulated among regional film groups, and the Coastal Management Office issued a reminder to avoid drifting over feeding activity, noting the unpredictability of shark behavior during high-density baitfish events.
It was the 9th of August, 2015, and the Outer Banks of North Carolina was settling into that particular stretch of evening where the heat loosens and the light flattens. Wind had picked up slightly, and small baitfish were breaking the surface in scattered clusters near the shoreline, the kind of low-key feeding activity that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The Outer Banks in late summer draws groups of younger people who tend to stay well past the afternoon. By early evening, the main beach crowd had thinned, but clusters of people remained along the water's edge. Cora Kendrick was 22 years old. She was spending her summer break at the beach with friends before heading back to college. Her friends said she always accepted a challenge without thinking, not because she was arrogant, but just out of habit. She was the type of person to say yes before you even finished asking the question. She hated hesitation and didn't want anyone to see her as scared. People loved her for that energy, and it always kept her leading the way in whatever the group did next. I've had friends like Cora, the ones who jump in first, whether it's a road trip or a dare. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's risky. As the light continued to fade, the group gathered near the shoreline. At some point, someone suggested swimming out to a sandbar visible roughly 40 yards offshore. The idea moved through the group as those things do, half dare, half low-stakes contest. When it reached Cora, she was already moving toward the water. Honestly, if someone in my group had suggested swimming to a sandbar at that hour, I'd probably have laughed it off. Knowing Cora, she would definitely not hesitate. Stayed closer to shore. People on nearby towels watched her heading out and then lost interest almost immediately. From the beach, it still looked harmless, just another person swimming farther than everyone else. Cora pushed outward through the surf as the sky continued to dim. By the time she reached the deeper section near the sandbar, the water sat at roughly 5 feet deep chest height. She was approximately 40 yards from her friends, treading water and calling back toward them. The baitfish were still active nearby, and the wind-driven churn and incoming wave movement created consistent surface disturbance all around her. In those conditions, Cora's silhouette would have been increasingly difficult to track from the beach. Bull sharks along the Outer Banks coastal waters are most active during warmer months, and low light conditions reduce surface contrast in ways that draw them closer to disturbances they would otherwise approach more cautiously. Someone treading water at that depth, with bait fish nearby and uneven splashing from wind chop all around them, produces exactly the kind of signal a bull shark will move toward. The shark approached from below and behind, consistent with how bull sharks move through disturbed, low visibility water. There was no readable surface warning before contact. The initial strike happened fast and low, and witnesses saw her drop under briefly before coming back up. When she resurfaced, something was clearly wrong. She wasn't swimming anymore, she was trying to stay upright. Her movements uneven and confined. Witnesses saw heavy splashing after the first strike, but from shore it became difficult to tell whether she was fighting the surf, injured, or still being contacted by the shark. There was no clear second strike visible from shore, just a widening area of disturbance where she had been. Over the next several seconds, her movements became less coordinated between the chop, the fading light, and the distance. Friends raised the alarm from shore immediately. Responders arrived and began searching near the sandbar. She was located not far from where she had last been seen, drifting just beyond the break. Cora was recovered shortly after the search began. She could not be revived. The The cause of death was confirmed as a shark bite, accompanied by severe blood loss and rapid incapacitation in open surf conditions. It was the 11th of October 2016, and the autumn conditions off Isla Guadalupe were rougher than ideal, swell running 4 to 6 feet, the converted liveaboard pitching in the chop. Guadalupe sits about 150 miles west of Baja California, and it's basically one of the top great white shark destinations on the planet, known for clear water and really big animals. Nils Halvorsen, 35, was a freelance underwater photographer from Bergen, Norway, on assignment for a marine wildlife publication. This was his third trip to Guadalupe, and he'd cage dived in South Africa and Australia before, so he genuinely knew his way around shark operations and wasn't the kind of guy who'd panic easily. He was shooting with a professional camera housing, the kind of guy who triple checks his own gear but doesn't think twice about whether the operator is doing the same with theirs. The operation ran 2 cage types, a surface cage for regular clients and a submersible cage that gets lowered to about 30 feet for experienced divers and photographers. The submersible hangs from a steel cable running through a hydraulic winch on deck, with the primary load concentrated on a single main cable despite secondary stabilization lines. The cable had been in service for 2 seasons. The operator had been running the submersible more frequently than the equipment was rated for to maximize bookings. Maintenance records showed it was within its rated life but had not been checked for wear at load points since the previous season. The captain considered canceling the submersible deployment due to the swell but proceeded at Nils's request. Nils entered the submersible cage alone, standard for photographers who need space. 3 large great whites were active in the area. The surface cage, running at the same time, had 6 recreational divers in it. Great white sharks at Guadalupe are habituated to cage operations but remain fully wild. Winch failure at depth creates an extremely difficult rescue scenario. A large shark made a close pass on the submersible, bumping the frame. The cage swung on the cable. The swell above created oscillating tension, loading and unloading the cable rhythmically. The winch mechanism partially failed, releasing cable in an uncontrolled descent. Investigators later found fatigue fractures at the drum connection point, consistent with repeated stress cycling. The cage had been operating near a steep underwater slope. The uncontrolled descent dragged the cage sideways along the slope until it wedged against a rock outcropping at roughly 70 feet total depth. The impact twisted the cage onto its side and pinned the door against the slope face. Nils's primary regulator was knocked loose during the impact, and his secondary air supply was difficult to reach in the twisted position. His tank was already partially depleted from the dive being underway for several minutes before the failure. He attempted to free the door, but the cage's position against the slope prevented it. Sediment from the impact had clouded the water around the cage, making visual contact from the surface nearly impossible. The crew initially struggled to figure out whether the cage had snagged on the slope or if the winch had failed. Emergency dive response began once they confirmed the winch malfunction. A rescue diver reached the cage approximately 12 minutes after the failure, using the remaining cable and bubbles to locate it in the disturbed water. By the time he freed the door from the slope and opened it, Nils's air supply was depleted. He was unresponsive. The rescue diver brought Nils to the surface using emergency ascent procedures. Nils was pronounced dead aboard the vessel. The probable cause of death was ruled drowning associated with entrapment. 12 minutes. The rescue diver got there in 12 minutes, which is fast by any offshore emergency standard, and it still wasn't fast enough. Nils had critically limited air when the winch failed, and between the disorientation, the regulator getting knocked loose, the cage pinned against the slope, and the stress breathing, by the time they got the door clear, he'd already gone through most of what he had left. I don't know what's harder to sit with, the idea that no one could have gotten there faster, or the idea that maybe, with a slightly different timeline, someone could have. Nils's camera housing was recovered intact, with footage up to the moment of the cable failure. The publication he was shooting for released only still frames alongside a memorial piece. The investigation identified winch mechanism fatigue and inadequate cable inspection as probable contributing factors. The operator was cited for maintenance deficiencies. Mexican maritime authorities issued updated regulations for submersible cage operations. It was August 4th, 2015, and the South African coast sat under the clear winter sky of the southern hemisphere's dry season, the sun bright and direct, but carrying the quality of winter light that doesn't hold warmth after it reaches the surface, the ocean. A deep, cold blue moving in long swells from the southwest. This was a working offshore fishing environment. Small private charter operations running out of regional harbors along a stretch of coast where the cold Benguela Current carries the nutrient density that makes this one of the most productive fishing zones on the continent. Travis Holloway was 32 years old. He worked as a regional sales manager and spent whatever time he could on the water with a consistent group of friends. He was a recreational angler with several years of experience on boats like this one, comfortable on the water, and not someone who spent much time thinking about the predators that use these waters. That disposition was not specific to him, it was the general default among recreational anglers on this coast. And I want to say plainly, I understand that disposition completely. When something has never happened to you or anyone you know, it stops feeling like a real risk and starts feeling like a statistic that applies to other people. Most of us live our whole lives inside that assumption without ever being corrected. The morning had been productive. Multiple fish had been landed throughout the trip. During the process of cleaning some of those catches, scraps and blood entered the water overboard, the unremarked standard practice on a working offshore vessel. Sometime before noon, one of the crew members noticed what appeared to be a large shark fin moving at the surface near the boat. He mentioned it. Others looked. The fin was visible briefly before disappearing below the surface. The collective read of that moment was that shark sightings in these waters were occasional and not unusual, something worth noting, and then moving past. The trip continued. Nothing about how the crew was working the deck changed. That is the moment I keep returning to. A large fin, seen, identified, and discussed, appeared near a vessel that had been putting organic material into the water for hours. Everyone on the boat registered it, and nothing changed. I find it hard to be harsh about that, because in the moment, it probably felt like the correct response. Shark noted, shark gone, carry on. That's how it goes 9 times out of 10. The problem is that the 10th time is indistinguishable from the other 9 until it isn't. What I do think is that someone on that boat should have said, "Let's be careful on deck today." That conversation didn't happen. That gap ended up being the one that mattered. Great white sharks along South Africa's western coast are year-round residents, not seasonal visitors, but animals for which this coastline represents a home range. Their behavior around fishing vessels is documented. They follow chum dispersal, investigate cleaning activity, and remain in proximity to boats generating food-associated stimulus over time. The animals seen near the boat that morning had been in the area for whatever reason, before and after the crew observed it. Great whites in South African waters are large animals, mature individuals commonly reaching between 14 and 18 feet in length and exceeding 4,000 pounds. Their attack behavior on surface targets involves approach from depth at speed, with the initial contact delivering the full momentum of the animal. There is no visible warning at the surface before the strike. The first indication is the contact itself. Travis was leaning over the gunwale to untangle fouled fishing gear when he lost his footing and went into the water. The engines were cut immediately. Flotation devices were thrown. The crew responded the way people respond in a man overboard situation, urgently, correctly, in the way that instinct and basic familiarity with boats produce when someone goes over the side. It was the right response. The shark was still in the area. Witnesses observed its surface near Travis within moments of his entry. The attack occurred before the crew could pull him aboard. Travis Holloway died from injuries sustained in a great white shark attack. He was 32 years old. He had not chosen to enter the water. He had not made a recreational decision that placed him in that position. He lost his footing on a task he had done dozens of times. That's the part of Travis's story that I find hardest to absorb. Not the shark, not the outcome, but the pure, ordinary randomness of a slip. Everyone loses their footing sometimes. On land, you catch yourself, or you don't, and at worst, you're embarrassed. On that deck, on that morning, it meant something completely different. The fall was accidental. The conditions surrounding it were not. In reconstruction, it stops looking like a single moment of misfortune and starts looking like an accumulation of organic dispersal, of hours in one position, of a sighting that was noted and filed away as unremarkable. Travis fell into the last step of a sequence that had been building quietly since the boat left the harbor. Not sudden, structured.
It was July 21st, 2024, in the lower Florida Keys. The morning light had just settled over the reef flats. The tide was slow, the air still, and the charter boats around the channel ran their engines at idle, unaware that a partially stunned tarpon was already drawing predators in from deeper water. The family, Ronan Atenal, his wife Maren, both 33, and their 9-year-old daughter Selby, had arrived on a rented skiff just after sunrise. Ronan, an architectural drafter from Atlanta, had planned the trip months earlier. Maren, a speech-language therapist, balanced his cautious habits with a calm confidence around the water. She had grown up swimming in lakes and believed their daughter should be comfortable in the ocean. This vacation was meant to be a simple break, a chance to snorkel, see parrotfish, and record underwater footage for a school project Selby was excited about. They chose a shallow reef close to the main channel, a spot recommended by the rental clerk for its clear water and low boat traffic. Ronan scanned the water briefly but saw nothing unusual. No fast currents, no dark shapes, no warnings from nearby vessels. Their choice to enter the water wasn't reckless. It was the natural result of calm conditions and years of predictable tourist snorkeling. However, none of them noticed the dispersing blood plume moving slowly with the incoming tide from the nearby charter boat's tarpon fight. Tarpon, nurse sharks, and barracuda often passed through these channels, but the most assertive predator in the region, the bull shark, was known for patrolling murky stretches, not clear shallows like this. However, late summer salinity shifts, and flat calm mornings sometimes pull large bulls into clearer water when bait fish gather over shallow structure. They can reach 11 feet and over 500 pounds, with a bite force suitable for crushing turtles. Their behavior is opportunistic, and they often key in on wounded prey. The last uneventful moments unfolded quietly. Ronan pointed out a cluster of yellowtail near the coral. Selby kicked gently. Staying close, Maren adjusted her daughter's snorkel. None of them saw the tarpon's drifting body, or the gray silhouette that rose from the deeper cut of the channel, moving with heavy, steady thrusts. The anglers later estimated the shark at 8-10 feet, thick-bodied, broad-headed, unmistakably a bull. It approached low, hidden by refracted light and silt stirred by the earlier fight. The strike on Ronan came from below and slightly behind. Witnesses described a sudden churn of white water and a deep splash, followed by a muffled sound that might have been the shark hitting bone. The bull shark drove upward with such force that Ronan's torso bent sharply as he was yanked sideways. His snorkel dropped from his mouth, and blood spread immediately in a widening halo. His legs spasmed once before he slipped under the surface. The anglers watching this unfold said that Maren reacted instantly, pulling Selby toward the boat's bowline, but the water around them had already changed color. She struggled to keep her footing with fins on, half swimming and half dragging her daughter. The blood from Ronan's injury mixed with the remaining tarpon trail, creating a concentrated scent that triggered the shark to strike again. This time, it rammed the stern of the Atonal's skiff, rocking it hard to one side. The impact forced Maren underwater briefly, causing her to lose grip on Selby for a moment. When she surfaced, she clutched her daughter again and pushed her forward. The second hit came fast. The bull shark turned through the clouded water and struck Maren's side, its jaws clamping from rib to hip. The angler saw her jerk backward violently, arms flinging outward. She tried to pull Selby up with one hand, but the force knocked the child loose. The shark dragged Maren under. Her legs kicked once, then stilled. Selby screamed for a moment, treading water near the boat's ladder. One of the anglers had already leapt into action, throwing a life ring and starting his engine, but distance and timing were against them. The water, thick with blood, masked movement beneath. When the shark rose again, it surfaced directly beneath the child, mouth wide, propelled by the scent. There was no thrashing or prolonged struggle, just a single upward surge and a rapid pull below, leaving only a brief splash and a widening patch of red. The anglers reached the Atonal's skiff within seconds of the final strike. They found no survivors, only drifting fins, a cracked snorkel mask, and the shaken boat rocking from the earlier collision. They radioed for emergency response, but by the time authorities arrived, evidence already pointed to a rapid, predatory sequence driven by the wounded tarpon and the shark's proximity. The Coast Guard recovered Ronan and Maren's remains later that morning, located separately along the channel edge. Selby was found the next day near a mangrove pocket 2 miles away. Officials described the injuries as consistent with multiple forceful bites and rapid submersion. A fisheries officer noted that the shark likely reverted to deep channel cruising once the stimulus faded, and it was never seen again. In the days that followed, local agencies issued a brief safety statement. The reef site remained open, though warning placards were updated to include feeding-related risk conditions. The Atonal's extended family flew in from New Zealand for private memorials, struggling to reconcile the sudden loss. They quietly handled arrangements while avoiding media attention.
It was the 18th of July 2016, and New Smyrna Beach in Florida was already crowded by mid-morning. Heat sat heavy over the water, and the surf was unsettled waves coming in fast, the kind that stir sand off the bottom and keep the water churned and brown close to shore. New Smyrna is on Florida's east coast, and people who study sharks know it well. It is not because the water is super dangerous or scary. Most people swim there and are totally fine. It is because the warm, shallow water is a perfect place for small fish to gather, and wherever small fish go, sharks follow to eat them. That morning, a lot of small fish were already swimming near the beach. Lifeguards walked around warning people to be careful because they could see shark fins in the water where the fish were eating. This was normal for New Smyrna, but it was still a real danger. The water was also very cloudy from the waves and sand, so you couldn't see more than 2 feet in front of you. Patricia Driscoll was 27. She worked independently, picking up freelance video work, outdoor content, travel footage, the kind of material that gets packaged and sold. People close to her described someone wired to act first and think second. Not careless in a deliberately dangerous way, but impulsive. The kind of person who sees something worth capturing and moves toward it before pausing to consider what else might be in the frame. That trait had served her well in her line of work. On July 18th, it put her directly in the wrong place. She was at the beach alone that day, phone already in hand, wading out into the water before most people had settled their towels down. By the time she was near the offshore, the surf sat at chest height approximately 4 feet deep. The water around her was murky and active. Baitfish were breaking the surface in scattered bursts nearby, and the combination of wave movement and feeding activity kept everything around her in a constant, low-grade churn. That's when she spotted a curved dorsal fin cutting through the water ahead of her. Lifeguards had already warned everyone. The smart thing to do, in my opinion, would have been for Patricia to walk back to the beach. Instead, she raised her phone to take a video. She assumed the fin belonged to a dolphin. That's not an irrational assumption on its surface. Dolphins and bull sharks share the same coastal feeding water along Florida's east coast, and from chest-deep surf with near-zero visibility, telling the two apart isn't always easy. But the decision that followed is harder to explain. Rather than creating distance, she turned partially away from open water, extended her arm outward, and began framing a selfie aimed at where the fin had been moving. Bull sharks working through a baitfish school aren't targeting people, but they respond aggressively to close-range movement and disturbance in low-visibility conditions, and Patricia was standing in exactly that environment, surrounded by surface activity with less than 2 feet of visibility in any direction beneath her. The shark made contact without any readable warning. A single bite struck across her upper thigh and hip area deep, and with enough force to knock her sideways into the water. She attempted to push back upright, but the shifting sandy bottom and the incoming surf worked against her. Before she could stabilize her footing, the shark made brief secondary contact in the same area, widening the wound further before pulling away into the murk below. Lifeguards reached her within minutes. She was pulled back towards shore and treated at the scene, but the injury itself was the problem. A deep wound to the upper leg in warm, open water produces a rate of blood loss that is nearly impossible to control in field conditions, no matter how fast the response is. Patricia became unresponsive within minutes of being pulled from the surf. She was pronounced dead that day. The official findings confirmed the cause of death as a fatal shark bite resulting in severe blood loss. After my last video, a lot of you said you would never swim in cloudy water again. Reading those comments made me think of Patricia. She was surrounded by rough, dark water, but she still thought she was safe enough to film. It was the 8th of November 2015, and the southern ocean around Stewart Island sat cold and dark under a low, overcast sky. Water temperature was about 52 degrees and visibility was maybe 2 or 3 meters, which honestly is not a good day for getting into a shark cage for the first time, especially someone who's never done it before. Peter Langeveld, 50, was a retired shipping logistics manager from Cape Town, South Africa, traveling New Zealand with his adult son. He'd grown up in South Africa knowing about sharks, but had never actually done a cage dive. His son talked him into trying it during the trip. Peter wasn't exactly enthusiastic about it, but figured why not? He was already down there. The operation ran out of a small converted research vessel, 4 divers max per session. The briefing covered cold water shock, low visibility, and one rule the crew kept repeating. If contact occurs with the cage, stay inside and duck below the bars. Surfacing outside the cage can expose divers to significantly greater risk. Peter entered the cage with 2 other divers. The cold hit immediately. Visibility was significantly worse than expected. The cage bars disappeared into greenish murk within arm's reach. Great white sharks around Stewart Island hunt in cold, low visibility water where ambush conditions favor the predator. Panic exits during cage contact have been documented in previous incidents. From below, a lone diver at the surface can resemble the movement profile of typical prey. About 15 minutes in, a large white made contact with the cage. In the murky water, Peter never saw it coming. The impact twisted him sideways, knocked the regulator out of his mouth, and flooded his mask simultaneously. Rather than retrieving his regulator and staying inside, Peter panicked. He pushed upward and surfaced outside the cage. He was now floating at the surface in a dark wetsuit in water with less than 2 meters of visibility beneath him. The crew on the boat saw him surface and immediately shouted for him to get back to the cage. Peter, disoriented and gasping in the cold, did not submerge. He was only several feet from the cage opening. The shark, which had circled after the initial contact, investigated the surface disturbance. The attack came from below, consistent with a single investigatory strike to the torso. Crew deployed a rescue line and used the cage frame to pull Peter back toward the vessel. He was out of the water within roughly 90 seconds of the attack, but the bite had caused fatal internal injuries. Peter died during the helicopter transfer to Invercargill Hospital. Several feet. He surfaced several feet from the opening of a cage that would have kept him alive. The water was so cold and so dark that his brain just said, "Go up and get air," which is what every human brain would say, and that one reflex is the thing that killed him. I find it really hard to call that a mistake, because it's what literally anyone would do if their regulator got knocked out in freezing, murky water. The investigation determined Peter's panic exit was the primary factor. The cage and equipment were structurally sound, and the operator was fully licensed with a clean safety record. The operator cooperated fully and added mandatory cold water familiarization sessions for first-time divers after the incident. The other 2 divers in the cage were uninjured. It was November 21st, 2013, and Maui sat under the specific overcast that follows a Hawaiian storm system, clouds lower and more uniform than the island's typical trade wind sky, the light flat and gray, where it usually carried the warmth of a subtropical November. The ocean was murky. Several days of heavy rainfall and significant wave action had pushed sediment and runoff into the nearshore water column, reducing visibility in the shallows to the kind of range where objects a few feet below the surface lose definition. Alyssa Greer was 33 years old. She was an accountant from Arizona who had planned this trip for months, a vacation following an extended stretch of professional stress that had made the idea of a week near warm water feel necessary rather than indulgent. She was a capable swimmer, comfortable in open water, and had come to the beach that morning specifically to swim. The conditions were not what she had anticipated. Everything about those conditions had been communicated to her before she entered the water. The reduced visibility, the elevated risk, the reason behind the advisory. She had access to that information, and she entered anyway, swimming farther offshore than most visitors that morning. I understand the impulse. I really do. More than I probably should. You save for something, you wait for it, you get there, and the ocean is right there. And there's a sign. And the sign isn't a locked gate. It's just words on a board, and the water looks like water, and you tell yourself it's probably fine. I get it. It just wasn't fine. Post-storm runoff creates a specific risk context in Hawaiian nearshore waters. Heavy rain drives organic material, sediment, and freshwater plumes into the coastal zone, reducing visibility for swimmers while introducing chemical and particulate stimuli into the water column. Tiger sharks in Hawaiian waters are documented foraging in these conditions not because they are drawn to storm systems specifically, but because the baitfish movement and runoff that follow rainfall represent an active feeding environment. What gets me about this is how invisible that process is from the surface. The water just looks murky. It doesn't look like it's doing anything in particular. But below the surface, from the shark's perspective, it's essentially a lit up signal. Tiger sharks possess sensory systems that carry real advantages in turbid water. Their lateral line detects pressure disturbances from moving bodies at distance. Electroreceptors in the snout register the electrical fields generated by muscular activity in nearby animals. Neither system depends on visual clarity to function. This creates a meaningful capability gap for a swimmer. In murky conditions, the shark can detect a person at range, while the swimmer has no ability to detect the shark until it is already close. Witnesses reported a sudden disturbance in the water and cries for help. Lifeguards responded within minutes and brought Alyssa back to shore, where emergency personnel began treatment immediately for severe arterial bleeding. She was transported to a medical facility capable of advanced trauma care. Despite the speed of the response, the vascular damage sustained in the water was beyond what the available intervention could reverse in the time remaining. Alyssa Greer died from her injuries.
It was July 8, 2015, and the Gulf of Mexico off Venice, Florida lay flat and green under an afternoon sky the color of bleached denim, the kind of calm that makes shallow offshore water look harmless until something moving just beneath the surface corrects the assumption. And for Taryn Kessler, 27 years old, that correction came in the form of a bull shark rising through a blood and oil chum slick that his own hands had spent an hour creating. Taryn Kessler lived in North Port, about 15 miles inland from the coast, where he worked irregular hours with a small drywall crew out of Sarasota County. He was not a fisherman by habit. He had been invited along by a friend who owned a 22-foot center console boat, and his reason for going was less about fishing and more about having somewhere to be on a Tuesday afternoon when no job was scheduled. People who knew him described him in largely the same terms: someone who needed an audience, who measured a good time by how many people were watching, and who defaulted to dares when the afternoon lost its momentum. Friends said that he was not reckless in isolation. He required witnesses, a crowd, some form of response. According to them, without that social structure, he probably would have simply sat at the stern and fished like everyone else. He had been on boats before, though not regularly, and he had grown up in Florida the way many coastal-adjacent young men do, with a vague familiarity with sharks that stopped well short of actual knowledge. His understanding of them was the kind built entirely from a lifetime of uneventful ocean swimming, which tells a person nothing useful about actual risk. He had no history of diving or spearfishing, no background that would have given him a working sense of what changed when you put a human body into water, actively loaded with blood and cut bait. His goal for the afternoon was likely the same goal he brought to most social situations: to be the most memorable person in the group. 2 miles offshore from the Venice fishing pier, the Gulf bottom is sandy and relatively shallow, with the boat positioned over a nearshore sandbar where the depth held between 25 and 35 feet, depending on the bar. That depth range suits bull sharks better than almost any other large predatory species operating in the eastern Gulf. Bull sharks are considered among the 3 most dangerous shark species in the world, not because of size alone, but because of where and how they hunt. Warm, murky near-shore water, shallow enough to allow ambush from below, rich enough in scent stimuli to keep them active throughout the day. Adults commonly reach between 7 and 11 feet in length and can weigh several hundred pounds. Their bite force is among the highest recorded for any shark species. They do not circle cautiously before engaging. In documented attack cases, the initial contact is typically fast, direct, and delivered from below the target with minimal warning at the surface. The group had been chumming for approximately an hour before Taryn moved to the stern platform. Chumming, releasing chopped baitfish and ground fish meal into the water to attract predators, produces a spreading oil slick and dispersal of blood and tissue visible at the surface, and with a light onshore breeze, the chum plume trailed down current several hundred yards behind the boat. By early afternoon, the water behind the boat had changed visibly. A greasy film stretched several yards off the stern, and pieces of bait fish floated in a loose, trailing cloud just below the surface film. One of the four men with Taryn later told investigators that he had already spotted a shark, dark, large, slow-moving, making a pass beneath the chum slick at least once earlier in the session. No one suggested moving the boat. No one proposed stopping the chum. The shark's presence was acknowledged and then set aside in the way that obvious information sometimes is when a group of people has decided to keep having a good time. Taryn started making comments about jumping in. He said more than once that sharks were basically harmless, a claim with no factual support that nonetheless circulated freely enough among people who'd never had reason to test it. Two of the men started pushing back with the kind of joking condescension that accelerates bad decisions in group settings, telling him he was scared, that he wouldn't actually do it. He was standing on the stern platform with one hand on the rail, the water below him brown, green, and murky with an hour's worth of chum, and without a life jacket, he dropped into the slick. He was laughing when he went in. Taryn entered the water backward off the platform and came up floating on his back beside the stern ladder, looking up at the men on the boat. He had been in the water for fewer than 10 seconds when one of the men shouted. The shark came from directly below, rising through the chum column in a single committed surge with no preliminary pass. Witnesses described the contact as immediate and total. No bumping, no circling, no hesitation. The jaws closed across his abdomen and lower chest in the initial strike, and the force of it drove part of his torso briefly out of the water before both bodies slammed back into the surface. He screamed at the moment of contact. What followed was not prolonged. The shark worked in short, lateral head shakes, the motion consistent with how a bull shark processes a large prey item, tearing rather than simply holding. The bite across his midsection was deep, the teeth penetrating through the abdominal wall into the body cavity. Blood spread rapidly through the chum slick, the two substances merging across several feet of surface water within seconds. The men on the boat were shouting. One man kept the outboard in neutral, while another leaned over the platform with a long boat hook extended toward him. One leaned down from the platform and told Taryn to reach for the swim ladder. His arms were moving, but the coordination required to grip the rung wasn't there. The shark released after several seconds. Taryn was still at the surface, on his side, producing short, audible sounds with each exhale. The boat hook was extended toward him. One of the men would later describe that moment as the point where he thought they might actually get him out. Then the shark returned. Witnesses later said they believed it was the same shark, though in the murky water, none of them could be certain. The second strike was lower, across the upper hip and pelvis, and the force of it pulled him briefly beneath the surface. Witnesses said he disappeared for 2 to 3 seconds, the spot where he had been replaced by turbulence and a rapidly expanding blood cloud. When he came back up, he was face down. The men hauled him to the platform using the boat hook and their hands, pulling him up the ladder and onto the deck. The injuries across his abdomen and hip were extensive, multiple deep lacerations opening the body cavity, internal tissue exposed, blood loss already severe and ongoing. By the time he was on the fiberglass deck, he had stopped responding to voice or touch. One of the men packed a shirt firmly against the abdominal wounds, while another tightened a belt around his hips in an attempt to stabilize the pelvic region and slow the bleeding. Another was already dialing. The boat's owner called 911 at approximately 3:41 p.m. while steering back toward Venice Inlet at full throttle, a run that normally took between 15 and 20 minutes from their position offshore. A nearby recreational vessel, whose occupants had heard the shouting, followed closely behind toward shore. Coast Guard personnel and paramedics met the boat at the marina approximately 18 minutes after the call was placed. Taryn was pronounced dead shortly after arrival and had not regained consciousness after being pulled from the water. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from catastrophic laceration and tissue loss to the abdominal cavity and pelvic region, consistent with shark bite. Time from injury to death was estimated at under 20 minutes. Investigators filed a report that focused specifically on the conditions at the time of entry. Active chumming in progress for over an hour, a large shark visually confirmed by multiple witnesses prior to the incident, and a deliberate choice by the victim to enter the water with full knowledge of both factors. The report was unambiguous in its framing. Nothing about the environment was hidden, unknown, or the result of bad luck. Every contributing condition had been visible and present before Taryn stepped onto the stern platform. No charges were filed against the other men on the boat. The owner cooperated fully with investigators. Taryn's family held a service in North Port the following week, attended by his drywall crew and the friends who had been on the boat with him.
It was the 3rd of September 2014, and the dry season heat sat heavy over a crocodile park on the outskirts of Darwin. The park ran this signature attraction where you get into a clear acrylic cylinder and they lower you into a pool with one of their biggest saltwater crocs. It's basically marketed as the safest possible way to be face-to-face with a 17-foot predator. Tamsin Brierly is a 29-year-old travel nurse from Manchester, England, midway through a gap year across Southeast Asia and Australia. She had posted about the experience on social media the week before, calling it the scariest thing she'd ever signed up for. The setup was pretty straightforward. You enter the cylinder from a raised platform, staff seal the hatch, and a crane lowers you into the pool. Thick, reinforced acrylic between you and the croc. However, investigators later noted that hydraulic seals on the lift arm had not been replaced on schedule, and a slow leak had been flagged by a maintenance worker 3 weeks prior without action. Tamsin entered the cylinder at approximately 2:15 p.m. Staff sealed the top hatch. The crane began lowering her into the pool. The enclosure's dominant male, roughly 17 feet, was resting at the pool edge about 15 feet from the entry point. What unsettles me about this one isn't the crocodile, it's the design. Everything about the attraction is built to make you feel like you're in danger when you're actually not. That's the whole selling point. And when the thing that's supposed to keep you safe is also the thing that traps you, the math changes really fast. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with dominant males reaching 17 feet or more. The enclosure's male had been conditioned to investigate surface disturbances during feeding. Their strike from rest is explosive and nearly instantaneous. The malfunction caused the crane arm to drop unevenly, swinging the cylinder sideways and slamming it against the concrete pool edge. The impact cracked the lower section of the acrylic near the waterline. Staff recognized the problem immediately and attempted the emergency lift. The hydraulic system did not respond. Manual override required reaching the pump housing on the opposite side of the platform. Water began pouring through the crack in the acrylic as the cylinder settled at a slight angle against the pool wall. The crocodile, conditioned to investigate disturbances at the water surface during feeding sessions, launched from the bank toward the damaged section. The animal struck once at the compromised area near the waterline where Tamsin's lower body was positioned. She sustained massive crushing injuries to her lower leg before staff regained partial lift control. The process took approximately 90 seconds. By the time the cylinder was raised, it had flooded significantly and Tamsin was unconscious. Emergency services reached the park within 15 minutes. Tamsin was transported to Royal Darwin Hospital, where she later died from traumatic crush injuries and catastrophic blood loss. The investigation flagged the hydraulic leak and the overdue seal replacement. The park halted the experience pending redesign and regulatory review. 90 seconds. That's how long it took from the hydraulic jam to staff getting partial control back. I've timed 90 seconds on my phone, just sitting in a chair, and it's nothing. Now imagine spending those 90 seconds in a flooding acrylic tube with a 17-foot crocodile at the opening above your head. After timing it myself, 90 seconds started feeling a lot longer than I expected. It was July 29th, 2020, and the Western Australian coastline stretched long and exposed beneath a winter sky, carrying the pale clarity of a dry afternoon The light sharp, the shadows running long, everything around it looking stable in a way that had nothing to do with whether it was. There were no lifeguard stations here, no designated access points, no facilities of any kind. It was a section of coast that people did not come to unless they were specifically seeking remoteness. Mason Vance was 25 years old. He worked as a construction supervisor and had spent years accumulating outdoor experience surfing, hiking, cliff diving. Friends described him as someone who moved toward challenges that other people stepped back from. In most circumstances, that is simply a personality trait. On this afternoon, it became the trait that structured every decision that followed. He had come to this section of coastline with a group of friends, not through any organized or guided activity, just people in private vehicles exploring a stretch of remote coast. When the cliff was located, Mason was the person who read it as an opportunity. The water below was deep. The drop appeared viable. Nobody in the group had any familiarity with the area, its currents, what species used these waters, or what conditions were running along this stretch of coast. Local fishermen operated in nearby waters, and the presence of schooling bait fish was something those fishermen knew well. That information was not available to the group standing on the cliff. Confidence is one of the riskiest things a person can carry into an unfamiliar environment, because it replaces the questions you should be asking with the feeling that you already know the answers. Mason jumped. He entered the water cleanly, surfaced intact, and began swimming not back toward the base of the cliff, not toward shore, but laterally along the coastline, toward a rocky shelf further along the base. Concerns were raised by friends watching from above, he continued. And this is where I find myself genuinely frustrated, not at Mason, but at the situation. He had already done the dangerous thing and survived it. He was in the water and okay. And then he made a second decision, to swim away from any possible exit, while people who cared about him were already worried. Tiger sharks are among the 3 shark species most consistently associated with serious human encounters globally. Mature individuals commonly reach between 10 and 14 feet in length and can exceed 1,000 pounds. They are wide-ranging animals that inhabit both nearshore and offshore zones, and they forage along coastlines where baitfish concentrations create favorable conditions. One of the friends watching from the cliff briefly spotted a fin breaking the surface near where Mason was swimming, visible for a moment, then gone. There was no prolonged display. No measured, circling approach that gave anyone time to register what was happening and respond to it. The encounter happened quickly, the way most encounters do, without the preceding minutes of visible drama that those watching from the height above might have expected. The cliff terrain, the height, the rough and uneven descent to the water meant that nobody could reach the base in anything close to useful time. Recovery was conducted the following day. The friends had raised concerns from the moment Mason entered the water. They had seen the fin. They had no way to act on either. Sometimes, the only position available to people watching a situation deteriorate is witness. I think about that a lot. Standing somewhere high enough to see everything and close enough to care, and having absolutely nothing in your hands. That's a specific kind of helplessness that I can't imagine doesn't fade.
It was March 17th, 2016, and the late summer sun over Muizenberg Beach in Cape Town hung flat and pale above the False Bay shoreline, the kind of morning that had drawn Zara Molinar and her father to this stretch of sand dozens of times before. Only this time, the murky water, churned by a week of shifting southerly wind and the tight schools of bait fish flickering near the shore break, would mark the last hour she ever spent standing upright. Zara Molinar was 24, a dental assistant at a small private clinic in Belleville in the northern suburbs of Cape Town. She was known at work for near-perfect attendance across 2 years of employment and for saving methodically toward a dental hygiene certification at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Her co-workers described her as disciplined and quiet, someone who kept her head down, stayed late when the schedule ran long on Thursdays, and rarely discussed anything beyond the work directly in front of her. She was not adventurous by any measure. She did not surf or dive, and had shown no interest in deep water. For her, the beach meant wading in the shallows and talking with her father, Hendrik, who ran a small plumbing business in Brackenfell, where they lived together with her mother. She helped him with his company paperwork most evenings, and the Sunday beach trip had functioned as a fixed point in their week for as long as either of them could remember. Her familiarity with Muizenberg was what had likely made her comfortable wading that morning. She had been coming to this particular beach since early childhood, always with Hendrik, and nearly 2 decades of unremarkable visits had built a quiet, unexamined confidence in that shoreline. She knew the shark spotters monitored the water from the mountain above and understood that warning flags went up when sharks were confirmed. That morning, Hendrik said that they had looked toward the lookout station along Boys Drive on Muizenberg Mountain and seen nothing raised. Neither she nor her father had any reason to treat this visit differently from the 200 before it. Muizenberg Beach curves gently along the southern edge of False Bay, its shallow, sand-bottomed break watched from an elevation of roughly 650 to 980 feet by a permanent shark spotter station on the mountain above the shoreline. Great white sharks are frequent visitors to the bay's inshore waters in late summer, drawn by the area's seal populations and the warm shallows that concentrate baitfish and their predators. Adult great whites in South African waters regularly exceed 15 feet in length and can weigh more than 4,000 pounds, with bite forces estimated to reach roughly 4,000 pounds of force. Their typical attack behavior in shallow, turbid water involves a high-speed approach from depth in near-complete silence, closing the distance beneath a target before driving upward at the moment of impact. Because of this approach angle, people standing only yards away routinely have no perceptible warning before the surface erupts. The conditions that morning were poor for both prevention and detection. A week of shifting wind had stirred the sandy seabed, reducing underwater visibility to approximately 6 to 15 feet and giving the surface a gray-green opacity that made subsurface identification from elevation nearly impossible. The shark spotter stationed on the mountain above had not yet raised the warning flag, as the protocol required confirmed visual identification of a shark before the alert was issued, and the water that morning made that confirmation unreliable. Under the beach safety system used at Muizenberg, warning flags and a shoreline siren are only activated after a confirmed sighting, and the absence of a flag does not indicate that sharks are absent from the bay. Several surfers positioned at the break, roughly 80 to 100 feet offshore, had noticed small schools of baitfish moving near the surface in tight, erratic formations closer to the waterline. None of them interpreted this as an active predator situation, and none communicated any concern to the swimmers or waders along the shore break. Hendrik and Zara entered the water around mid-morning, wading in slowly until it reached approximately chest depth on Zara, roughly 4 feet. They stood facing the beach, positioned close together, talking casually. Witnesses described the pair as relaxed and stationary. Zara stood slightly ahead of her father by roughly 2 feet, between him and the open water at her back. A surfer paddling parallel to the shore approximately 90 feet away later told investigators the pair appeared completely calm and in no way distinguishable from any other 2 people standing in the Muizenberg shallows on any other late summer morning. The attack offered no visible warning. Hendrik later told investigators that the first thing he registered was a heavy impact against his daughter, a concussive force transmitted through the water before he had processed a cause. A great white shark, described by witnesses as a very large adult and estimated by some observers at lengths approaching 23 feet, drove upward from below the surface in a near vertical strike. Its head broke the waterline as its jaws closed across Zara's torso and upper abdomen. Surfers offshore described a sudden eruption of white water and a single sharp cry before the surface around her turned dark. The force of the strike lifted her partially out of the water and threw her forward and sideways, sending Hendrik off balance in the chest-deep shallows. The shark released almost immediately after the initial strike and disappeared beneath the surface. The release changed nothing already set in motion. The water around Zara quickly clouded and spread in thin reddish swirls through the turbulent surf, the blood diluting and dispersing through the churning water. She dropped face forward into the shallows, unmoving, her face partially submerged. Hendrik scrambled upright and moved toward her. He later told police the turbulence from the impact made it difficult to get a stable grip. The water around her was still churning. She did not respond to his voice and offered no movement of her own. He managed to get both arms beneath hers and pull her partially upright. The surfers at the break had already turned their boards toward the disturbance at the first eruption of white water and were paddling hard. One witness later estimated they were approximately 90 feet offshore when the strike occurred and reached the scene in under 2 minutes. As the surfers closed the distance, one of them reported seeing the shark's dorsal fin break the surface several yards behind Hendrik, completing a slow, deliberate arc before slipping beneath the water again. By the time the first surfer arrived alongside Hendrik, Zara was fully unresponsive, her head lolling forward. The surfer later told investigators that the injuries across her torso and upper abdomen were immediately and unmistakably severe. 2 surfers helped support her body in the water, while a third turned his board toward the beach, paddling hard and shouting for help. The lifeguard on duty heard the shouts, used a handheld radio to contact emergency services, and immediately began clearing swimmers and waders from the water. Zara was carried through the shallows and onto the sand with the help of surfers and nearby beachgoers. Lifeguards initiated CPR and attempted to manage the bleeding using the rescue equipment available at the station. Witnesses described the wounds as extensive. Paramedics arrived approximately 11 minutes after the emergency call was placed. Zara Molinar was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report, in plain terms, identified the cause of death as traumatic injury consistent with a large shark bite. Primary wounds ran across the upper abdomen and lower torso, with deep lacerations extending into the abdominal cavity. Significant hemorrhage from severed abdominal vasculature was identified as the proximate cause of death. The report noted that the injuries were unsurvivable regardless of how quickly emergency response arrived. SharkSpotter personnel and local authorities closed the beach temporarily, conducting an aerial and surface review of the bay the following morning. No immediate changes to the spotter protocol were announced, though the incident drew attention to the gap in detection during low-visibility water conditions and renewed discussion among beach safety officials about the limitations of the existing system. Zara Molinar was buried 8 days after the attack at a funeral attended by co-workers, neighbors, and extended family from Brackenfell. A family friend told a local community newspaper that Hendrik had been the one holding his daughter in the water and that he had not released her hand on the beach until the paramedics physically stepped between them. In the weeks following the funeral, his plumbing business effectively ceased operating.
It was the 17th of March, 2016, and the late summer morning was overcast and cool along the Gansby coastline of the Western Cape. Water temperature was sitting around 58 degrees, visibility was pretty average for Shark Alley, and there was this thick smell of diesel and chum hanging over the boat that honestly hits you before anything else does. Kendra Stottlemyre, 47, was a dental office manager from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her college roommate Margin Tewksbury, 49, a real estate agent from Bend, Oregon, had been the one to finally book the trip after they'd been talking about doing a shark cage dive together for over a decade. It was basically Margin's bucket list thing, and she dragged Kendra along. The operation used a galvanized steel cage with welded cross bracing, tethered beside the vessel with flotation pontoons and steel tether points. The operator was licensed, but had a history of deferred maintenance and inspection noncompliance, running aging equipment well past recommended service intervals to keep costs down. The cage had been in service for several seasons. Maintenance records reviewed afterwards showed the cage had not undergone a documented structural inspection in over 14 months. The morning briefing was pretty basic. Keep your arms inside, hold the top rail, duck when the crew shouts. 4 clients entered the cage. Kendra and Margin positioned themselves at the front bars. Margin had a waterproof phone case and had been taking photos between shark passes. The last image recovered shows both women smiling through their masks, captured moments before submersion. The chum slick went out, and the first shark appeared within 20 minutes, a large female estimated at over 15 feet. Now I've looked at that photo way too many times. 2 women in their late 40s, masks on, grinning. No clue that the steel bars behind them haven't been inspected in over a year. Great white sharks in Shark Alley are drawn to cage operations by chum and bait. Adults commonly exceed 15 feet. When they're going after bait, they can hit cage structures with pretty incredible force. Cage breaches, while rare, are documented in South African waters. The shark charged the bait line, missed, and struck the cage at speed. Investigators later concluded that corrosion and repeated stress had likely weakened the welds on the lower left section of the cage frame. The impact caused the lower section to bow inward and partially separate from the cross bracing, opening a gap wide enough for the shark's snout and jaws to penetrate the compromised opening. The shark thrashed violently in the compromised section, making repeated contact with Marjean's lower body. Other divers scrambled upward toward the surface. Kendra, directly beside Marjean, was struck by the thrashing tail and driven against the opposite bars. Crew grabbed the divers and hauled them back onto the swim platform. Marjean was brought up with massive lacerations to the upper leg and groin region, consistent with catastrophic vascular injury. Blood loss was immediate and severe. Crew tried first aid on deck, but she went into cardiac arrest during the boat's emergency run back to harbor, and they couldn't bring her back. Kendra sustained broken ribs and a fractured collarbone from the impact. She survived and was hospitalized. The operator voluntarily halted dive operations during the investigation. Marjean's waterproof phone was recovered. The final image later circulated online after being shared among family members. Kendra was right next to her, close enough to touch, and she walked away with broken ribs while her best friend bled out on the deck. I don't know how you process that kind of closeness to someone who doesn't make it.
It was March 15th, 2016, and the rugged coastline of Port Campbell stretched along Victoria's treacherous Great Ocean Road, where winding clifftop highways carved through limestone formations above the churning Southern Ocean. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow roadway as dense sea mist began rolling inland from the turbulent waters below. David Wilson, a 41-year-old insurance adjuster from Melbourne, gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the notorious stretch of road with his family packed into their sedan for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. His wife Sarah sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing nervously at the steep drop-offs that appeared and disappeared through gaps in the coastal vegetation. Their two children, 8-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Connor, occupied the back seat, both absorbed in their electronic devices as the scenic drive continued along one of Australia's most dangerous highways. David had driven this route several times before during business trips, but never with his entire family aboard. The Wilson family had been looking forward to this trip for months, planning to explore the famous 12 Apostles rock formations and stay at a coastal resort near Lorne. David's demanding work schedule had kept him away from home frequently, and this weekend represented a rare opportunity for quality family time. The Great Ocean Road's reputation for spectacular scenery came with an equally notorious history of tragic accidents, particularly along the sections where the highway hugged the cliff faces above the ocean. The weather conditions that afternoon were particularly treacherous, with intermittent rain showers creating slick patches on the limestone-based roadway. Local authorities had issued warnings about reduced visibility and dangerous driving conditions, but many tourists continued to navigate the scenic route despite the hazards. The combination of narrow lanes, inadequate shoulder space, and the constant threat of oncoming traffic made even experienced drivers nervous on this stretch of highway. There had been several close calls during their journey, but David's confidence in his driving abilities and their tight schedule convinced him to continue. The family's excitement about reaching their destination overshadowed the growing concerns about the deteriorating weather and road conditions. The family's peaceful journey took a deadly turn when Connor dropped his gaming device between the seats and began frantically searching for it in the narrow space behind his father's seat. David made the fatal decision to assist his son while maintaining his speed through a particularly challenging section of the coastal highway. Taking his eyes off the treacherous road for what seemed like only a moment, David reached back to help Connor locate the device while simultaneously trying to navigate a sharp curve that appeared suddenly through the thickening mist. The combination of reduced visibility, wet road conditions, and his momentary inattention proved catastrophic as the vehicle's front wheels crossed the center line just just as an oncoming truck appeared around the bend. David yanked the steering wheel hard to the right to avoid the collision, but overcorrected on the slippery surface, sending the sedan careening toward the cliff edge at dangerous speed. The vehicle smashed through the inadequate safety barrier with tremendous force, the metal guardrail offering little resistance as the family car became airborne over the 70-foot drop to the rocky coastline below. The sedan plummeted through the misty air for several terrifying seconds before striking a jagged rock formation that jutted from the cliff face approximately 40 feet above the churning ocean. The violent impact crumpled the vehicle's roof and shattered every window, sending glass fragments throughout the passenger compartment. The collision's tremendous force ejected Sarah through the destroyed windshield, her body tumbling through the air toward the turbulent waters below, while her family remained trapped in the mangled wreckage. Sarah's unconscious form struck the ocean surface with devastating impact, the force likely causing fatal injuries before the cold southern ocean waters could claim her. Her body was immediately swept into the turbulent currents, where water temperatures barely above 50 degrees and powerful undertows ensured that survival was impossible, even for an uninjured swimmer. Great white sharks are the Southern Ocean's apex predators, capable of reaching lengths of 20 feet and possessing one of the most powerful bite forces in the animal kingdom. These solitary hunters frequently patrol coastal waters and are particularly dangerous due to their opportunistic feeding behavior and incredible speed. While sightings of large sharks are rare off Victoria's coast, they are not impossible, particularly near seal colonies along the rocky shoreline. The cold waters and unpredictable conditions make these areas inherently dangerous for any human who enters them. The twisted metal holding the Wilson family's vehicle gave way almost immediately under the tremendous weight and structural damage. The sedan plummeted toward the churning waters below, spinning end over end before crashing into the ocean with a tremendous splash that sent spray high into the air. The vehicle's remaining windows exploded from the impact as seawater began rushing into the passenger compartment. David and his children, already critically injured from the initial cliff impact, had no chance of survival as the freezing Southern Ocean water flooded their lungs and the vehicle sank rapidly toward the rocky bottom 40 feet below. The combination of massive trauma, hypothermia, and drowning claimed their lives within minutes of entering the water. Marine rescue teams arrived within an hour of receiving reports about the crash, but found only an empty section of highway where the safety barrier had been destroyed and tire marks leading to the cliff edge. Extensive underwater search operations involving divers and sonar equipment located the submerged vehicle 3 days later. Recovery efforts revealed evidence that marine scavengers had been active in the area, a grim reminder of the ocean's unforgiving nature and the predators that patrol these dangerous waters. The investigation into the Wilson family tragedy revealed that this particular section of the Great Ocean Road had been the site of numerous accidents over the years, with inadequate safety barriers and poor visibility contributing to multiple fatalities. Local residents had petitioned for improved infrastructure for decades, but budget constraints and the challenging terrain had delayed necessary upgrades. The Wilson crash became a catalyst for renewed safety initiatives, though the improvements would come too late for this family and others who had perished on this notorious stretch of highway.
It was March 7th, 2018, and the South Australian coast was moving through the back half of its summer, the heat of February beginning to ease, the mornings carrying a faint coolness before midday reversed it. The ocean in this region has a specific character that people who fish it regularly recognize. Cold water driven upward by deep current upwelling, nutrient-rich, and home to the kind of prey biomass that sustains large apex predators at the top of the food chain year-round. Weston Keene was 39 years old. He worked as an administrator for a small regional school and spent the majority of his free time fishing from the kayak he had owned for several years, a vessel that gave him access to stretches of coastline that larger boats couldn't approach. He launched alone regularly and preferred it that way. Solo kayak fishing several miles offshore is a normal recreational activity for experienced anglers in this region. By mid-morning, Weston had caught and retained several fish aboard the kayak. Throughout the morning, he had brought fish alongside the vessel to handle them, a standard part of managing a catch from a small watercraft. The movement of struggling fish against the hull and the organic material entering the surrounding water during handling produce a dispersal into the water column that spreads outward with current. In water that hosts large predators, this is a recognized risk factor. It is worth being precise about this. The relationship between fishing activity and individual shark encounters is statistical, not mechanical. A great white's presence on a given morning has its own independent causes. The activity does not create the shark. Under specific conditions, it may draw one closer, but the link is a risk factor, not a guarantee. And I think it matters to say that, because I don't want these stories to feel more predetermined than they actually were. Great white sharks are the apex predator in the cold, upwelling-driven waters of southern Australia. Mature females, the largest individuals, commonly reach between 15 and 20 feet in length and can exceed 4,500 pounds. They are capable of explosive acceleration from a stationary position and are documented hunting large marine mammals with approaches that involve high-speed commitment from below. A kayak at the surface of these waters presents a visual and acoustic profile that great whites in this region are documented investigating. Witnesses aboard a nearby recreational vessel observed the strike. The impact was sufficient to flip the kayak and put Weston in the water. The shark returned as he attempted to stay afloat. The witnesses moved toward him. They did not reach him in time. Weston Keene died from injuries sustained in a great white shark attack. He was 39 years old. He had witnesses. He had people moving toward him. He had done nothing dramatically wrong, and none of that was enough, because the gap between a strike like that and a survivable situation is a gap that distance and good intentions rarely close in time. That's not a failure of the people on the nearby vessel. It's just the arithmetic of the situation. It was the 29th of April, 2013, and the morning off the North Shore was warm with moderate swell from a passing system. A commercial cage dive operation was running its daily trip to a site about 3 miles offshore, where Galapagos and tiger sharks showed up pretty regularly. Brennan Yelvington, 38, was a software developer from Portland, Oregon, on a solo vacation. He'd booked the dive on impulse during his second day in Oahu, kind of one of those spur-of-the-moment, why-not type of decisions. He had basic snorkel experience, but had never been in a shark cage before. His social media from the trip was mostly beach photos and restaurant plates. The dive was the one thing on the itinerary that actually scared him a little, and he'd almost talked himself out of it the night before. The operation used an older, retrofit floating surface cage that had been converted from a marine research cage and was never purpose-built for commercial shark diving. The cage door was a side-hinge steel grate secured by a drop bolt latch, a non-standard modification from the original design, basically just a metal pin that drops into a hole in the door frame. Divers enter from the boat's swim platform. A crew member latches the door from outside, and the cage hangs at the surface. Brennan's group entered second. The swell was causing the cage to repeatedly surge against the swim platform, metal grinding on metal, and the crew member securing the latch had to steady himself one-handed against the railing while trying to drop the bolt with the other. The drop bolt did not fully seat into the frame hole. Investigators were later unable to determine whether the latch failed mechanically or had simply not fully engaged during deployment. Tiger sharks are the second most commonly implicated species in fatal attacks on humans. Adults regularly exceed 12 feet. In cage operations, tiger sharks persistently investigate cage structure. A door that is not fully latched can be pushed open by a shark's body pressure. A large tiger shark, estimated at roughly 13 feet, had been circling the cage for several minutes. It made a close pass on the door side. The shark's body pushed against the unlatched door and it swung open. A surge rolled through the cage as the door opened outward, knocking Brennan off balance toward the gap. He went through the opening before he could grab the bars. He was now outside the cage in open water, with a large tiger shark within roughly 10 feet. The shark turned sharply toward the sudden movement, initially veering toward him before turning and biting during the confusion. The bite hit Brennan's leg and hip, likely damaging the femoral vessels. Other divers in the cage pulled themselves to the opposite wall. Crew began emergency extraction. They got him back on the boat with a rescue line within about 2 minutes, and the crew attempted hemorrhage control using towels and a tourniquet, but the blood loss was just too fast. He lost consciousness during the emergency run back to harbor and was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the dock. One bolt, a metal pin about the size of your index finger that didn't drop into a hole on a boat that was rocking in swell, operated by a crew member who needed both hands but only had one free. I keep trying to be angry at someone specific, and I can't find a clean target because the whole thing was just a chain of small, ordinary problems that lined up wrong for about 5 seconds. The operator received citations and voluntarily halted cage dives during the investigation. Hawaiian Marine authorities referenced the incident in updated equipment inspection requirements. Brennan's camera detached during the rescue, and the footage was corrupted by salt water.
It was May 18, 2015, off the Sinai Peninsula in the Red Sea. The water was calm, unusually clear for that season. From the deck of the dive boat, nothing suggested danger, but the faint current shift, suspended silt, and the quiet absence of usual schooling fish in the area hinted the environment could change quickly. Arlen Myro was a 34-year-old marine equipment technician known among colleagues for his cautious planning. He specialized in underwater survey systems for a research company. This particular trip, however, he took for himself. He had long wanted to film the remains of a 1950s freighter resting near a popular drop point and hoped to capture footage to submit to a regional marine archive. Arlen arrived 2 days earlier at a small dive-focused lodge, planning to document the hull before further decay. Despite scattered pelagic sightings, his dive seemed reasonable for an experienced diver, and he carried standard safety gear, including a redundant regulator and dive computer. The wreck's waters were muted blue, with Anthias darting among broken plates and shadowed cargo holds below. Oceanic white-tip sharks were historically present in the Red Sea, but are generally uncommon near popular wrecks and rarely aggressive toward divers unless provoked. Typically measuring 9 to 13 feet with broad pectoral fins, they will sometimes react defensively to sudden intrusion or bright lights in tight spaces. Arlen proceeded with his plan, preferring to begin filming in the quieter morning window. His dive partner, a French hobbyist named Luc Bravant, noted in later interviews that Arlen seemed entirely at ease, focused on capturing clean footage. Once in the water, the pair descended along the mooring line, settling near the freighter's bow at around 82 feet. Arlen adjusted his lighting several times, cutting through the dim interior of the forward corridor. Out of nowhere, an oceanic white tip surged from the recess with sudden acceleration. Luc later reported no circling or investigation, just an abrupt movement. While adult white tips generally react defensively rather than hunting divers, the shark had been resting in the shaded hold and was startled when Arlen's lights swept too close. Its first motion was a fast, direct lunge, powered by a strong tail thrust. The animal closed the distance within seconds, and Arlen only registered it as a dark mass in his peripheral vision. The impact was violent and immediate. Arlen collided with protruding wreckage, which likely caused the most severe trauma. The shark may have made contact, but did not bite with the force or intent described in other oceanic white-tip incidents. The strike drove Arlen sideways into the rusted wall, and his regulator briefly slipped from his mouth as his camera rig spun away. The shark's jaws clamped along his upper arm and shoulder, likely a brief investigative nip rather than a full clamp. Arlen attempted to bring his right hand to his inflator hose, but most tissue damage resulted from impact with jagged wreckage and secondary blunt trauma. The water clouded within seconds. Luc moved toward him, but hesitated when the shark released and circled tightly, its broad fins cutting slow arcs. The animal bumped Arlen's sinking body once more, nudging him downward before moving off into the gloom. Luc reached Arlen and tried to stabilize him, but the injury was grim. His regulator hung loose, and his left side was unresponsive. Luc secured the inflator and began a controlled ascent, pushing Arlen upward. At around 40 feet, he realized Arlen had no remaining muscle tension and was losing blood rapidly into the current. The crew hauled both men aboard. The captain radioed the nearest Coast Guard post within minutes. A patrol boat was already on routine sweep nearby and diverted toward them. The crew transferred Arlen aboard, where Coast Guard medics performed a rapid assessment, but the trauma was already fatal. Post-mortem analysis would likely show blunt force trauma and lacerations consistent with wreck entanglement. Authorities documented the equipment, Arlen's camera rig, and the torn section of his wetsuit. The footage from his camera showed only the last stable seconds before the strike. Quiet corridor, the faint motion of silt, and then a rapidly approaching blur before the image collapsed. His family requested the video not be released. His body was flown home within the week. A brief memorial was held by his company, attended by technicians who had worked with him for years.